In China, there is a saying that has endured for centuries. Do not read water margin in your youth. Do not read romance of the three kingdoms in old age. On the surface, this sounds like a warning about books, as if reading the wrong novel at the wrong age might corrupt the young or make the old cunning and suspicious. But think about it carefully, and that interpretation starts to feel a little thin. Water Margin and Romance of the Three Kingdoms are two of the greatest works in all of Chinese literature, celebrated for centuries, studied in schools, adapted endlessly across every medium. To suggest that simply reading them could fundamentally alter a person seems to overstate the power of fiction and underestimate the resilience of the human mind. So, perhaps this saying was never really about reading at all. Read it differently, and something deeper emerges. What it is really saying is this: do not become Walter Margin when you are young. Do not become Romance of the Three Kingdoms when you are old. Not a warning about books, a reminder about the shape of a life. Every stage of life has its own natural character. Youth has its way of being. Old age has its own. Water Margin and Romance of the Three Kingdoms each represent a kind of imbalance, the kind most likely to appear at the wrong moment, in the wrong season of a person's life. Water Margin has always drawn young people in, not because of its moral complexity, but because of its energy. Heroes who fight back when wronged, who act on instinct, who place loyalty above everything, and never hesitate. There is something deeply compelling about that kind of force. Direct, uncompromising, alive. But youth, at its core, is not a season for certainty. When a person is young, the world is still forming around him. What seems right today may look different tomorrow. What feels intolerable now may, with time, become something they understand. This uncertainty is not a weakness. It is the very condition in which a person begins to develop genuine judgment. The questioning, the hesitation, the slow accumulation of understanding. These are not obstacles to growth. They are growth itself. Water Margin runs in the opposite direction. It offers a world of pure momentum. Act on instinct, trust the impulse, let blood and loyalty be the compass. That spirit has its place. But when it becomes the dominant mode of a young person's inner life, something gets lost. The willingness to sit with uncertainty, the patience to let understanding arrive slowly, the openness that only comes from not yet knowing the answer. The greatest danger for the young is not naivety. It is becoming worldly too soon. Romance of the Three Kingdoms draws its power not merely from scheming, but from something more penetrating, an unflinching insight into human nature. Cao Cao reads people, Liu Bi moves people, Zhuge Liang anticipates people, Sima Yi outlasts people. Read deeply enough, and you begin to see motive behind every gesture, calculation beneath every kindness, strategy woven into the most ordinary exchange. In a world of war and empire, that kind of perception is a survival skill. But old age was never meant to be a season of perpetual vigilance. A person who has lived long has already passed through upheaval, absorbed loss, carried responsibility, and learned, often painfully, what truly matters. The natural movement of that stage of life is toward release, away from calculation, away from defensiveness, away from the exhausting habit of measuring every relationship against hidden motives. Let the children find their own way. Let the world turn as it will. There is a particular grace that belongs to old age, and it cannot be found while the mind is still at war. Romance of the Three Kingdoms, absorbed too deeply in that season, can quietly corrode it. A slow-forming suspicion that every kindness carries a price, that every gesture of warmth conceals an agenda. And once that lens is fixed in place, the ease and trust that old age deserves become almost impossible to recover. The greatest danger for the old is not decline. It is the inability to finally let go. And here is where the real depth of this saying begins to reveal itself. Walter Margin and Romance of the Three Kingdoms are not simply two famous novels. They are portraits of two very different kinds of drift, the kind that most naturally threatens us at different points in our lives. Youth is most easily swept away by impulse and the seductive clarity of force. Old age is most easily trapped by the weight of its own accumulated perception, mistaking experience for truth and insight for wisdom. This understanding of life as a progression of distinct seasons is not a modern idea. It sits at the very heart of Chinese traditional thought. Confucius described it in perhaps the most famous passage of self-reflection in Chinese literature. At 15, I set my heart on learning. At 30, I stood firm. At 40, I had no doubts. At 50, I understood the will of heaven. At 60, my ear was attuned. At 70, I could follow my heart's desire without transgressing what was right. Each stage carries its own orientation, its own task. Youth is for exploration, not for arriving at conclusions too quickly. Middle age is for responsibility, not for endless evasion. Old age is for release, not for allowing the wisdom of a lifetime to harden into the rigidity of a lifetime. To be young like Walter Margin is to mistake urgency for direction. To be old like Romance of the Three Kingdoms is to mistake perception for understanding. The young who rush toward maturity lose something they cannot recover. The old who cannot loosen their grip carry a weight that was never meant to follow them this far. The deepest wisdom is not in being right at every stage. It is in inhabiting each stage with the quality it asks of you. Youth has its own kind of wonder. Middle age its own kind of weight. Old age its own kind of freedom, if you allow it. The greatest mark of a person's maturity is not how quickly they move into the next chapter of life. It is how fully they honor the one they are living now. So the old saying remains: do not read Walter Margin in your youth. Do not read Romance of the Three Kingdoms in old age. It was never about the books. It was always about the life.